He watched as the town of Kashmir disappeared as the bus drove into the all-too-familiar woods that surrounded the prison. In a way, this was an odd kind of homecoming for him. How many times had he driven this road to get to work? How many times had he yawned as he got off work, trying to keep his eyes open as he drove to his apartment at the Whispering Pines apartment complex? The windows had the dark tint on them, the kind that no one could see through, and that was a blessing. If anyone had known he was on that bus, they might have formed a blockade and just hung him right there in the park. Some of the residents of Kashmir would have probably eaten picnic lunches while he breathed his last. It was pretty short notice, but there might have even been commemorative t-shirts. After all, it wasn't every day the nightclub killer came home to stay. He reflected that they might not even recognize him if they'd seen him from the windows of the prison bus. He had spent most of his trial and confinement at the tiny jailhouse they had in Cummings. The guards knew who he was, knew what he was, and they had been more than happy to mistreat him now that there was nothing he could do about it. His food had been thrown on the floor at least once a day. His commissary had been lost more than a few times, and he thought it likely that he had lost 50 pounds in that little cell. Didn't really matter. When your life was restricted to an 8x8 cell that you never got to leave, very little mattered at all. He'd done endless push-ups, sit-ups, and crunches. He'd eaten bugs when he was hungry, something the jail had in abundance, and drank water more often than not when the bugs weren't plentiful. He looked like a new man, like a different man, and he doubted anyone that he had known before would recognize him when he came back. He came back to Stragview, not through the front gate, as he had so many times before, but through the sliding metal gate that ushered the new inmates into their life of shadow and violence. The buses were usually full, but today there was a slim roster indeed. Besides him, shackled to the seat behind a cage at the back of the bus, there were 8 others. One of them, a pedophile who had tried to talk to him for the first week before finally giving up, had been someone he'd seen at jail when he'd spent the last 8 months there, but the rest were strangers. People passing time in this place, some of them never to see the light of day again. That was all they were. Not like him. Not special. He was special, and everyone knew it. The new fish in the front of the bus were herded off, the COs yelling and swearing at them as they hustled them out and lined them up. He assumed he would be next, taken to stand with them, but as they filed into the orientation building, his restraints were still in place. He started to get worried. This wasn't how things usually were. Would they take him straight to his dorm? Maybe they didn't think someone who had been part of Stragview's daily operation needed to be oriented. Maybe, he dared to think, they might give him a welcome that befits someone who had once walked amongst them and had now fallen so far. He was starting to get worried that they would just leave him here for the night, when 2 guards he knew came striding onto the bus. Sergeant McCowan and Officer Gerber were in the category of COs that fell under the heading of not to be fucked with. McGowan was about 5'6", but he was as wide as he was tall, with arms like a longshoreman. Gerber was less intimidating, but he was an ex-Marine, and he was no stranger to violence. The look he gave Gerber didn't shake the man in the least, but he had a special grievance against him. Gerber, Nosy Gerber, had been part of the reason he was here at all. If it hadn't been for Gerber and his need to put his nose where it didn't belong, he might have gotten a less harsh sentence. "Inmate B50967, Sergeant McCowan growled. "The Warden wants to see you. Are you going to comply, or are we going to drag you across the concrete?" Inmate B50967 didn't bother answering. He just nodded and held his hands out to be uncuffed. Guess again, superstar. Those hands stay shackled, legs too. But we will be unhooking you from the bus, since you can't very well take it with you. You so much as lift that foot before I tell you to, and the warden can visit you in the infirmary for all I care. You feel me?" Inmate B50967 nodded, and when the two of them caught him under the arms, he rose, amiably enough, and let them escort him to see the warden. McCowan called it in over the radio, letting the guards on the yard know that he had a bad guy on the way that needed a clear shot. B50967 walked up the same concrete path he had taken to his dorm every night, right up until Gerber had discovered his little secret, and though the inmates faced away from him, he could hear them whisper to themselves as he passed. "That's him. That's the guard-turned-killer. The one from E-Dorm? They say he killed 7 women before they caught him. Shit, think he needs a gang to watch his back? What's his name again? Who knows? Just another stinking guard who slipped up. It's the only difference between us and them anyway. They didn't get caught as often as we did." B50967 listened to them whisper the whole way to the tower, but when the procession suddenly stopped, he looked down to see who had been stupid enough to get in their way. He looked down to find a familiar orange wraith looking up at him with big green inquisitive eyes. All the guards knew about old One-Ear, all the inmates too, but most of them never got close to him. There had been one, he seemed to remember, and he had paid the price for the friendship. B50967 knew guards who brought cat food in their bags in an attempt to entice the old Orange Tom, but he'd never seen a guard get close enough to pet the old compound cat. When it twined between his legs, giving his ankles a quick nuzzle, B50967 knew that something significant had happened. It seemed the cat didn't think of him as a guard anymore, and he had been accepted as one of the rabble. The cat swiped at McGowan in passing, but as he ready to boot to kick out at it, the cat shot off like a bolt of lightning and disappeared over the fence into the rabbit run. "Spooky," the old sergeant said, but if Gerber agreed, he gave no indication. They led him to the looming edifice that now stood as the warden's permanent residence, and as they came through the gate, McCowan told Gerber that he could go. "No need for both of us to have to wander into this spooky place. I'll meet you in the captain's office when it's time for lunch," he promised, and the officer seemed more than happy to be done with this particular detail. As the tower gate closed, locking both McGowan and the inmate inside, the old sergeant turned back to him, his warmth disappearing. "You act up," McGowan promised, opening the door and pushing him in, "and I can promise you that I'll lose you in confinement. This ain't something that happens often. Very few inmates come into the tower to speak with the warden, and if you aren't absolutely respectful, I might bounce your head off the steps before I drag you to the box. You understand?" B50967 nodded, a slow up and down, and McGowan led him up the stairs to the very top. The climb was all the more difficult because of the shackles on his legs, but he would be damned if he let McGowan know that he was discomforted. The weak and hectic thing that he had once been was gone, along with his old name. He was B50967 now, and if it didn't fit, then he was sure that after a couple of decades in this place, it would. They came to a round wooden door at the top of the stairs, and when McGowan knocked, a cultured voice told them to enter. B50967 came into the warden's office with the clink of chains and the sound of Chopin. The old recorder player was warbling out the sound of the old master as he plied his craft, and B50967 was unsurprised to see a familiar Orange Tom sitting on the desk and purring under the warden's gentle hand. He knew those hands could turn cruel if they wanted to, and when the old man turned those expressive red eyes on him, he shuddered all over. "Ah, there you are. I wanted to see how you were, given that you used to be one of mine in a very different sense. Thank you, Sergeant. You may go now." McCowan blinked. "Sir, I'm not supposed to—" "You are supposed to do as instructed, Sergeant. Do you think I can't handle a man, shackled hand to wrist if I need to? I've been throwing inmates around since before you were born." McCowan gave his charge a hard look, promising violence if he acted up, but it appeared he was far more afraid of the man in the pinstriped suit sitting behind the huge oak desk. "I'll be right outside," McCowan promised, closing the door behind him as he stepped onto the landing. That just left the warden and his new charge, alone with the orange tomcat. "Cribs, cribs, cribs," the warden intoned like a disappointed father. "It pains me to see you like this, especially when we both know you were just giving them what they deserved, weren't you?" B50967 said nothing. He just sat with his hands in his lap and the chain swinging from his ankles. "After all, you were the stronger, the more cunning. Why shouldn't you have killed them? Your only crime was hubris. Really, leaving a trail like that on a work computer. It's like you were asking to get caught. Although your incarceration helps me more than you can imagine." He looked up to find the warden grinning at him, his face locked in a predatory smirk that he always wore. "You see, I need something done around here. A little housekeeping, if you will. There are people here who are undermining the structure I've put in place. They are beholden to something that isn't in the best interests of this facility, and I want it to stop. I want you to stop it, Cribs." B50967 shook his head, pointing to the little ID card that was clipped to his chest. "Cribs is dead," he said, his voice rusty after months of silence. "I'm nothing but a number now. The man who sat in the dorm and wrote in that little journal is gone. I just want to live what life I can with the time I have." The warden nodded. "I suppose there's something to that. Many people find peace in a place like this. I don't think you're one of those people, however." The smirk was gone now, the playful attitude had evaporated, and the warden was ready to make a deal, it seemed. B50967 wondered if his soul would be the currency for this transaction. "You didn't kill those women because it brought you peace. You weren't trying to tip the scales of right or wrong. You killed them because you wanted to, and you never work without a purpose. So allow me to give you a purpose. I have a list of 12 men who have a combined sentence of 730 years. If that sounds familiar, it's because it's the exact same amount of time the judge gave you for your crimes. He likely thought himself clever. No one could survive 700 years, and that is what I intend to make sure of. These men have to die, so you can live, so you can go back to the life you left behind. Whether you return to killing, or whether you return to something less likely to bring you back here again, is up to you. But it's an opportunity for life, and that is something. What do you say? Keep in mind, this isn't an offer I make twice." He didn't ask what the men had done. He didn't ask how the warden would release him without repercussions. And he didn't ask why the warden would ask something like this of him. At the end of the day, B50967 didn't care. The promise of freedom, of stalking the night once again, of hunting worthy prey, was enough for him. "I accept," he said, and the warden's smile was more predatory than the grin of a hyena. As McCowan took him to his new home, the warden telling him that he would be in touch, B50967 reflected on his new purpose. 12 men seemed an acceptable trade for his life, and he found himself chuckling a little as McCowan scowled at him. "What's so funny, killer?" he asked. "Or is it finally settling in that you've ruined your life for what exactly? A little slash and splash?" "I was just thinking how nice it'll be to get back home," he said. And when the door to H4 slammed shut behind him, he knew it was true. He put his things in cell 18, empty except for him, and as he lay on the bunk, he wondered how long it would be before the warden contacted him. A day, a week, a year, made no difference. He would be ready. You're still here. Thanks so much for joining us for tonight's spooky tale. If you'd like a little bit more spooky in your life, why not click on one of the videos that appears at the end of our story, or maybe head on over to one of our playlists where you can get your fill of spooky content. If you like your spooky a little more tactile, I've got a new book that's come out. If you'd like your own copy, there's a link below in the description where you can get your own copy of my spooky book. If you like what you see here on the channel and think you might like to support in a more monetized way, then why not come over to Patreon or become a member on YouTube? Speaking of, let's go ahead and thank our members now. Thanks to Civ Garstad, Unicorn Hollow, and Army Dude for being our Spooky Ghost contributors. Thanks to Janet, Lee Kendall, Saikat, Ronda J, Sue Casper, and Valinator for being our Spooky Skeleton contributors. And thanks to Oh Snap, Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Stephanie Carrington, Tyler Parker, Cinnamon Fox, Grim Reaper, TomBoiTopUwU, and Queen Sheebah for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. And a big thanks to Scott Donahue for being our Ghostly Writer tier contributor. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you'd like to support the channel, then come on down to Patreon or become a member on YouTube. Spooky Skeleton tier contributors, that's our $5 tier, get their spooky 12 hours early at 8:30 a.m. as opposed to 8:30 p.m. My time, of course. And while Ghostly Reading is only a tier that's available on Patreon, you get a signed copy of my book anytime I write one on your doorstep in, hopefully, a timely manner. If you'd like a book, we have many on Amazon. I've got links below if you'd like to follow those. Should get you to my page so you can buy any one of my 8 books I believe we're up to now. I'm sure they'd look really nice on your shelf, and I'll sign them for you if you can find me out in the wild. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.